U declines like this. Tu is the nominative, te the accusative, tui the genitive, tibi the dative, and te the ablative. That's you singular, not you plural. We'll get to that later. Right, so ready to construct some sentences. The cook has daughters. The cook is the subject, so it would go into the nominative. Coquus. It is a third person singular verb, so we would find the correct verb, habeo, and find the right person ending, which you'll remember, as it is the third person singular, is T, giving us habet. Daughters is the object of the sentence, so it would be in the accusative case, filias. And, as you'll remember from lesson 1, verbs drift towards the end of a sentence. So, the cook has daughters would be coquus filias habet. Now, let's try something harder. I do not love you. I is the subject, so it is in the nominative case, ego. Love is the first person singular, so it is amo. But it is not love, so it would be non-amo. You is the object, so it is in the accusative case, te. So, I do not love you would be ego te non-amo. But as we can tell, I is the subject because of the verb, amo, being first person singular. We don't need the ego there. It could just be te non-amo.
We'll try one final one.
Alright, that's a perfect example of one of our teaching methods, a method that's called the grammar translation method. And this method's important because this is actually how people learned languages for hundreds of years, up until the 1900s. This lesson's being taught entirely in English. So although the students are there learning Latin, they're L2, the instruction from the teacher is entirely done in the L1, in this case, English. And a typical grammar translation lesson will have these long explanations of grammar where students are really just analyzing the language and translating back and forth from Latin to English and from English to Latin. And this method actually goes all the way back to the Renaissance, when people had a focus on and even an obsession with learning classical languages such as ancient Greek and Latin. It's important to realize that people weren't learning these languages in order to communicate back and forth using those languages. They're really just learning those languages to be able to read literature, or really sometimes just in order to sharpen their minds. To understand that literature, you had to be able to translate that into your language. You had to understand those classical languages, and so that was why we learned languages. And so learning foreign languages was not done for means of communication, but really just for academic purposes, for sharpening our minds.
We'll try one final one. Next, the slaves hide the slave woman of the cooks, because you carry the son and daughter. Not the most well-used sentence, but it'll do perfectly well for our purposes.
And so for several hundred years, this is how people learn languages, by translating back and forth and having long explanations of grammar and so on. A method that we call grammar translation. And if you fast forward all the way up to the early 1900s, people are still learning foreign languages this same way. So now if somebody wants to travel and they want to learn English or French or Chinese, there's a good chance that they're actually learning those foreign languages the same way that people used to learn ancient Greek or Latin. But as the 20th century progressed, we began to get new ideas about how people learn languages and the reasons why people learn languages, how they use them socially. And so as these new ideas came into our view, we started seeing new teaching methods developed throughout the 1900s. And many of those teaching methods are still used today, and those are the methods that we're going to be looking at right now. In our lesson on second language acquisition, we discussed the difference between learning and acquisition. Learning is that conscious process. It's what we think of when we think of learning. It often includes a teacher at a whiteboard, and while they're teaching us, we're consciously thinking about what we're learning, and we're aware that we're learning it as it's happening. Whereas acquisition happens a little differently. It's a subconscious process where we are picking up the bits and pieces of the language and making sense of them for ourselves. We're not normally aware of this process as it's happening. While this definition of learning is typically how we learn inside a classroom, acquisition is normally how we learn outside of the classroom, or how we practice and pick up the language when we're just going about our day. In learning, we learn our target language by analyzing it. But in acquisition, we acquire that language not by analyzing it, but by using it. And as we go through these teaching methods, you'll see that some teaching methods get students to analyze the language, whereas the goal of some teaching methods is to just get students to use the language and to pick up the pieces of that language just through the usage of it. To use a common phrase, some things are taught while other things are caught. And depending on what teaching method we use, our job as a teacher might be to teach the language, or it might simply be to facilitate the language so that students can catch it and pick up those pieces. And finally, another thing you'll notice about teaching methods and this idea of learning versus acquisition is that some teaching methods will focus on accuracy, or they'll focus on the form of the language and are the students being correct with their usage of the language. And other teaching methods will focus on fluency. They'll focus on the meaning of the language and are students able to get their meaning across and communicate what they mean. The video that we saw with this Latin lesson, this is clearly an example where the students are expected to analyze the language. They're not being expected to use it. The focus is on accuracy and understanding the bits and pieces of that language, not on being able to communicate and get their meaning across in that language. It's not about that at all. The students may not even speak the target language of Latin very much at all during the lesson. Whereas teaching methods that focus on acquisition may have extreme amounts of speaking and communication in them. So our view of language and where we fall on this idea of learning versus acquisition, this can determine a lot about our teaching method and what a typical lesson looks like in our classroom. And that is why this topic is so important.